Last week we had just begun with chapter 12, and we had only done the very first verse of chapter 12. A great and wondrous sign appeared in
Just
heaven.
guessing if we throw the finished
A woman
ones on the
clothed
floor,
with the sun
somebody
and the
will
moon under her feet,
everybody-
with a crown of 12 stars on her head.
Brian, would you repeat that again, please? I didn't quite get it.
The gallery was too noisy.
Yeah.
A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. Hi, Shade. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Okay, that's all we got
Okay, I
to last
remember
week.
that now, thank you.
And the important part of that verse that we need to make sure we keep in our mind is that it is apparently the case that the woman clothed with the sun is a symbol for the church.
2 minutes.
Well, here comes
So,
Joyce and Fred.
She may, the woman may very well stand for the ideal community of the chosen one of God. Well, hi, guys.
Hi.
Hey, stranger. How you doing, buddy? Okay.
Hello.
So, from there today, we start with chapter 12, verses 3 and 4, and it has to do with the hatred of the dragon. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child the moment it was born.
That's kind of ghoulish.
Ooh, wasn't that somewhere else recently, devouring the child?
Yes,
Oh.
mentioned a little bit earlier.
Okay,
So we can sit here and say, well, the woman must be the mother of Jesus, the child must be the Messiah, and so forth. But I think there's more to it than that. I think the dragon represents evil. It represents the Antichrist, if you will. The woman represents the church. So that if the dragon is attempting to devour the child, evil is attempting to swallow up the church. Okay? All right. The great dragon of chaos.
You said a mother and a child.
Yes, Jesus would be the Messiah, the child.
Okay.
Now, the great dragon of chaos is referred to here by John, actually appears throughout the Old Testament in different forms, or at least by different names. In some places, it's called Leviathan, the great dragon of the oceans, the deep. And you can find that in places like Psalms and Isaiah and a whole bunch of other spots. In some places, it's referred to as Behemoth. And in other places, like in Isaiah, the great dragon is referred to as Rahab.
Rahab was a prostitute.
Yes, well, I don't think the dragon was, but the same name is applied to the dragon. So it is the connection of the dragon and the sea which explains the rivers of water the dragon emits to overcome the woman, because Leviathan was the great serpent from the sea. Okay, the dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns. Is that it?
10 horns, I think.
They represent power, and the 7 diadems represent power over the kingdoms of the world, but not the kingdom of God. So it says, the dragon sweeps the stars from the sky with its tail. You want to find that in the Old Testament? Daniel 8:10.
It says that exactly?
Yes. The dragon wants to devour the child. You want to find that? Jeremiah 51:34. John is still using all of these prophecies and symbols from the Old Testament. Now herein lies an eternal truth, as Christianity sees it, I think. Man and woman.
Thank you.
Hi there. Men and women
Jesus, what's this?
are fallen creatures. We are always under the attack of evil powers. We are always struggling, perhaps, to reach for a higher life. We're always struggling to overcome evil and the powers of evil. But the powers of evil are always looking for an opportunity to frustrate our upward reach. And that whole struggle reaches its climax on the cross. So, in other words, we know there's evil in the world. Nobody would disagree on that. How do you characterize that evil? Well, I'm sure there are still some people who characterize it as a guy in a red suit running around with a forked tail and horns on his head. The devil. You characterize it any way you want. People will disagree on all different kinds of definitions about Satan and the devil and all the rest. One thing remains clear. There is evil. And however you characterize it, that's entirely up to you to do as you wish with that. So, in verse 5, here's what it says. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron rod. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Okay, the child is supposed to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. That comes directly out of Psalm 2:9, where it predicts the coming of the Messiah who will rule all the nations of the world with an iron rod. Okay?
Wouldn't they have stopped believing that the Messiah was going to rule the world at this point?
Well, you would have thought so, but the Jews never did. And as a matter of fact, there are still Jews in the world today who still think that. They are still waiting for the Messiah. They are still expecting the great advent of the day of the Lord and all the rest. And I think there's an awful lot of Jews in the world that are in an awful lot of different sects, and there's a whole continuum of Jews, okay? And some of them are very orthodox, and some of them are extremely liberal. A lot of them are strictly Jew by politics, by political definition. So there's a whole wide spectrum there. But there's still some. They're still waiting for the Messiah. Still don't see the Christ as the one who was promised, even though he fit all the prophecies of the Old Testament, even though he was himself a Jew. And the reason for that is because the Jews have always had it in their mind what the Messiah should be like. And when the Messiah came, he did not fit their concept of what the Messiah should be.
That donkey didn't work.
Well, instead of realizing their error and readjusting themselves to the Messiah at hand, they continue to insist, no, the Messiah has to be here. And so they've always missed it. Of course, on the other hand, there's a worldwide movement, Jews for Christ. And there are lots and lots of Jews every year that convert to Christianity. Come back into the fold of the chosen people, which is us now, right? Okay.
It banished to the outer court again, is what you're saying.
Yeah, right. Now at birth, the child is rescued from the dragon. It's snatched up into heaven and the very throne of God. There's a problem here, if you think about it. This picture takes Christ directly from his birth to the ascension into heaven. Can you do that in one breath? I mean, his entire earthly life is missing. So what's the significance of that? Well, the scholars say there's two possible explanations. First of all, John, the writer of Revelation, is only interested here in the fact that Jesus is delivered from hostile forces by the direct action of God. And that second of all, John is not focused on the human Jesus in Revelation. Through the book of Revelation, John is focused on the risen, exalted Christ in heaven, not as an earthly person. This is the exalted Christ who is able to rescue his persecuted people. Those poor Christians that are being brutalized and killed at the time that John is alive. Now, at this point, verse 6, the woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. That number is familiar to you, right? Okay. The woman escapes the dragon. Huh?
Tell us again
Yeah,
about that number.
1,260 days is the length of the rule of
Somebody Epiphanies.
Antiochus Epiphanes.
Well, okay.
That horrible time in Jewish history where the temple was desecrated, pigs were offered on the altar, it was illegal to be circumcised. He tried to stomp out the Jewish religion. And so that 1,260-day period goes down in Jewish history as the most pathetic, worst time. So whenever the Jews ever talk about disaster after that, that's what they use as their reference point, the 1,260 days. Nothing can get any worse than that. When the end comes, it's the 1,260 days, because that's the Jewish mindset. Well, the woman escapes the dragon by fleeing into a desert where a place is prepared for her. Wait a minute, that sounds kind of familiar. Does that ring a bell with anybody?
Yep.
Where?
Abraham's other wife.
Well, Abraham's wife, Hagar,
Hagar,
Yeah,
yes.
that's her name.
okay. Yeah, who else flees into the desert?
Oh, Rachel?
How about Elijah?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Elijah flees into the desert where he is taken care of, where things are prepared for him, even though it may be locust and honey. For John the Baptist, Jesus fled into the desert. It's a very common thing.
Who was Lot's wife? Got a pillar of salt, what I'm thinking of. They fled Sodom.
They fled Sodom.
And she turned into a pillar of salt.
Yes, now that was her.
She was on it too.
She's a pretty salty character.
We don't know who it,
Riverboat.
No,
I can't think of her name.
I can't either at the moment. But anyway, another thing you need to know is that during the 1,260 days of the reign of the horror of Antiochus Epiphanes, thousands of Jews escaped into the desert so that they could continue to worship the way they wanted to worship. So in this chapter, when it says the woman flees into the desert to a place prepared for her where she's taken care of for 1,260 days. Again, if you're assuming that the woman represents the church, now think about the meaning. Okay? We know that thousands fled into the wilderness to continue worshiping, and it's carefully documented in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, latter part of the chapter. So that kind of explains what's happening here. But then we have Satan entering the picture here. And it says, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him." War in heaven? Wait a minute. I thought heaven was a place where there was no war and violence. I thought heaven was a place of heavenly peace. Right? What's this with war in heaven? Well, the dragon, also the serpent, also the devil, also Satan, is at war with Michael, the angel. It makes you wonder whether the dragon, evil, hates goodness so much that he literally pursued the Messiah right into heaven and then got cast out? Time out. We need to examine the picture of Satan we get from Scripture first. And it's complicated. Like anything in this book is easy. The most ancient story is of primeval war in heaven. Satan, who was not necessarily called by that name at that time, but Satan was an angel who wanted to be higher than God and was therefore cast out of heaven.
Is that Lucifer we're talking about? Was that
That's
his other
another,
name?
that's another name.
Okay.
Yeah. Even the Babylonians, before the Jews, had a similar story of Ishtar, the god of the morning star, who rebels against God and was cast down from heaven. The sin, the downfall is pride. That's it. Now in the Old Testament, Satan is still pictured as an angel under God's command and with access to God. If you want to, you can check this out in Job, chapters 1 and 2, where Satan is actually referred to as one of God's sons. Or you can turn to Zechariah, where it describes how Satan is able to appear in front of God, in the presence of God. Well, this is all kind of alien to the way we think about things. But the word Satan originally meant adversary. Okay? Satan was not the devil. Satan was not evil impersonated. Satan was an adversary. King David, the great king of the Jews, was the Satan of the Philistines. He was the big adversary of the Philistines. King Hadad became the Satan of Solomon. And that's the way the word was used, adversary. So in the Old Testament, Satan is the angel who was in favor of prosecuting mankind in God's presence. He was our adversary. And again, you can find references to this in the book of Job, in the book of Joshua, in Zechariah, and some of the Psalms. On the other side, you have the angel Michael. Now, Michael was seen by the Jews as the counsel for the defense of man as he was being tried before God. So man appears before the throne of God. Michael is the defense, and Satan, the adversary, is the prosecutor. But even at that, Satan still is under the jurisdiction of God. That's the way you're thinking. However, when we get to the New Testament, Satan changes into something else entirely. Satan literally becomes the devil. In Greek, diabolos, which means the slanderer. Now, that's important because he becomes the seducer of mankind. He becomes the one who tempts man and women into doing things that are sure to bring charges against them before God. So, in the New Testament, we find Satan as follows. He seeks to seduce Jesus through temptation in the desert. He puts the scheme of betrayal into the mind of Judas. He attempts to cause the fall of Peter. He persuades Ananias to keep some of the money that was supposed to go to the church. He causes illness and pain and misery for all kinds of people, so on and so forth. So Satan now becomes the enemy of God and of man. He now becomes the evil one. Today, for us in the modern world, he personifies evil itself. He is that force in the world that opposes goodness. He is the dark side of the force. Okay?
But it's interesting that in the fall, in the final war, he doesn't achieve a rank higher than Michael. So he never has a direct conflict with God. God delegates that to the sergeant of arms.
Right, right.
And that's as far as it goes.
Right.
The sergeant takes care of it and everything's fine. Interesting that he doesn't get a rank any higher.
And of course, we find out as we go along that Satan knows from the get-go he can't win. He knows he's going to lose. So what does he do in the meantime? He raises as much hell as he can.
Can't win the war, but he's winning a lot of battles.
You're not kidding.
Doesn't God kind of need Satan to keep the good folks good?
Well, that's a great argument because we would say today, you can't have good unless you have evil.
Can't measure it at least.
Yeah, I mean, if there was no evil at all and everything was good, you wouldn't have anything to compare the goodness against, and so what would happen then?
But
You have
isn't
to
that
have-
supposed to be what heaven is?
Supposedly.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's a heck of an argument. We could spend days talking about that one. And it's the same thing as saying, well, you can't have beauty unless you have ugliness.
Now,
Because
Lewis
if
will
you don't have
argue-
ugliness, there's no way to define beauty.
Lewis will argue that actually you can't have evil for evil's sake. You have to have good. Good was first.
Yeah.
And because evil cannot exist against itself.
Right.
It has to have good. So his argument is good has always been,
Always, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. You're talking about C.S. Lewis?
yeah.
Everybody know who C.S. Lewis
Yes.
is? By the way, did you know that C.S. Lewis was originally an atheist?
Yes. Well, no, he didn't start out that way. When he lived in Ireland with his folks, he was a Episcopalian, I think.
Right, but he became an atheist.
He did when he went to college. That
And
screws
then,
everybody up.
do you know who it was that converted him back to Christianity? C.R.
McDonald?
Tolkien.
To Tolkien, yeah,
Oh,
Good friends,
yeah.
and Tolkien was the man who brought him back to Christ.
They drank a lot of beer on Friday nights in the pub.
As Benjamin Franklin said, beer is proof that God loves us and wants us happy.
Brian,
Yeah,
we also wouldn't have a use for free will.
exactly. And you know, that's a big hang-up with some people. They say, well, if God is so powerful and omnipotent, why would he give us free choice? I mean, that hampers God, doesn't it? So why would he do a thing like that? And the only explanation I've heard that rings true with me would be, if you have to love somebody, what good is your love? If you choose to love somebody,
There you go.
your love becomes of value. So God does not force us to love him or to follow him. He gives us the choice. Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth anything. You know, God doesn't want to force us to do it. He wants us to choose to do
Exactly.
it.
That's the Lewis argument.
And so that's basically the idea behind free choice. Okay. Now that we have identified the dark side and Darth Vader is present right here in this chapter, we move on to verses 10 through 12. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. This is a song the martyrs are singing. And they are rejoicing that Satan has been cast out of heaven. There's a problem, though. Satan's been cast down to earth where we are. So, you know, what's good for one is not so good for the other. But now the pure force of evil is against good. And this picture is made even clearer when seen against the historical background in which John is living at the time. People are being arrested. People are being tortured. People are being killed simply because someone informed on them. The Roman citizens were encouraged and paid to inform on the Christians.
So they had PC to them too, huh?
Right. In other words, the Christians were being slandered against. They'd get reported and they'd be slaughtered. They'd be killed.
It's like Germany.
Hmm?
Like Germany.
Yeah, it was the same kind of thing. Well, that's not the only example either. There are other places.
Sadly.
Who exactly are these martyrs? those who have overcome Satan, those who have not yielded to Satan's temptations and threats and violence are the martyrs. This is in John's time now, okay? There's another way to put it. Every time we choose to suffer rather than disobey God, we defeat Satan. Okay? That makes us a martyr. You don't necessarily have to be crucified physically to be a martyr. The victory of the martyrs is won through the blood of the Lamb, meaning on the cross. And through his resurrection, Jesus overcomes the worst that evil could possibly do. What could be worse? How could evil do anything worse than crucify a person? I mean, that's the ultimate. So those who follow Jesus and commit their lives to him share in that same victory. Now, furthermore, through the sacrifice of Christ, we are forgiven. And once you are forgiven, there is no longer anything for which you can be accused of. See how this fits in with the concept of the accuser, the slanderer? If you follow Christ and are forgiven, you can no longer be accused or slandered of anything, because it's gone, it's forgiven. So, the martyrs are victorious because they lived, actually, the great principle of the gospel. They did not consider life more important than loyalty. And there were thousands that died that way. Powerful, very powerful. I wonder, per capita, how many Christians today would do the same?
Well, you got a lot of Muslims doing it.
Yes. And there are places in some of the Arab or Muslim countries, also in China and in Africa, where Christians are horribly being persecuted and killed.
No, what I meant was Muslims are dying martyrs' deaths in their belief systems.
In their way of thinking.
Yeah, that's why they blow themselves
The
up.
big difference is, as I see it, is that the Christian martyrs died because their obedience was required by their faith. The Muslims died because they are using their faith to their own ends. Good point.
And also, they believe when they die, they are gaining something for themselves.
Right.
The virgins.
Even more so, as opposed to what we believe they have earned something for themselves. Whereas we do not believe you can earn anything.
That's the key.
We believe that it's a free gift. But these radical Muslims, in my humble opinion, they are using their religion to justify what they do.
They hijacked it.
Yeah, they hijack their
Just
religion.
They hijacked it.
Yeah, they hijack their
Just
religion.
just like the Christians hijacked Christianity and went killing everybody.
There are Christians who have done that, and
Same
there are
program.
Jews who have done that
Yeah.
in every religion. You cannot take your religion and justify what you want to do. What you're supposed to do is to adjust yourself to the tenets of the religion.
Anything other than love doesn't justify.
That's right. And the vast majority of Muslims would agree. The vast majority of Muslims would agree with
That's the
that.
sad part.
They just don't speak out.
Well,
They can't.
They
They
can't,
better start.
because
Well,
those are the
they
ones.
have, actually.
Yeah.
well, I think in a country like America they are, because they feel safe pretty much in doing that. But until such time as the Muslims themselves rise up and defend their true faith, there's going to continue to be a great deal of persecution and discrimination by others who just don't understand. The Muslim people are going to have to stand up and try to solve that problem themselves for the rest of us.
Assimilation wouldn't hurt.
You know, I was raised most of my life with some very discriminatory attitudes against Muslims until my brother's oldest daughter married one. She is Roman Catholic, he's Muslim. And I thought, oh brother,
Yeah.
what kind of a mess is this going to be? And they are very happily married with 3 children. They profoundly love each other. And we had an opportunity to meet his entire family.
Wonderful
What a
people.
wild party that was. And it changed my attitude. He's a fine young man, and the reason their marriage is a success is because he was willing to allow her and her children to be raised Roman Catholic. Anyway.
But after
off
9/11,
the track.
he told Ryla, and they had just been married, he said to her, and I just think this is such an act of love, I don't think you should be with me for a while. And she said, I will be with you forever. But I mean, his main concern was, would she be persecuted after 9/11? And I thought that was really an outstanding virtue of Alan to have done that.
Yeah.
Well, the bottom line is that this Satan is cast out of heaven, but he still has power on earth. He knows that he cannot win in the end, and he will be destroyed, so he rages as fiercely as he can while he has the time. That's the concept. We got time for just one little bit more. Verses 13 through 17.
Is this in 12? Is this in 12, Brian?
Yeah.
This is
chapter
still in
12.
chapter 12. And he performed great and miraculous signs. Wait a second. I missed a verse somewhere. This is the attack of the dragon. Another beast coming out of the earth. I'm in chapter 13. No wonder I'm messed up here. Ah, here we are. Ha. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and a half of time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. You know, they ought to make one of these shows like, what's that, with the rings, Lord of the Rings, and where they have all these monsters and everything on it. It makes a great movie. People go wild over it. So the dragon, the devil, having been cast out of heaven, attacks the woman, mother of the man-child. Again, the woman stands for the church, God's chosen people now, from which comes the anointed one, the Messiah, Jesus. And symbolically here, the devil can injure the child by injuring the mother. The meaning is that evil can damage the church. And in so doing, by persecuting the church, in reality is persecuting Christ. Okay, make sense? Well, the woman escapes on the wings of a great eagle. Pretty good trick. But it is a symbol from the Old Testament when talking about the upbearing of a person in the arms of God. The symbol of eagle's wings is used. You can find it in Exodus, you can find it in Deuteronomy. They shall rise up as the wings of eagles, and so on. The dragon of chaos was a sea serpent, and so, spewing floodwaters out of its mouth is associated with waters. Throughout the Old Testament, you can find references to that in Psalms in a number of places. And then it says the earth swallows up the floodwaters. That, they say, possibly means that nature itself is on the side of those who are faithful to Christ. Even the earth and the universe are on the side of goodness. If it was all created by God, we would hope it would be good.
Yep.
Then the dragon goes to war with the rest of the family of the woman, which would be all the rest of those in the church. Persecution has spread over the whole church and brought agony to the faithful. And of course, in the time of John, that's the way it was perceived. All the faithful were being persecuted. And so the evil dragon is now attacking the church. That's the way he's gonna get even with the Christ. Well, next week, we jump into chapter 13, and we'll deal with the Antichrist again and the number 666. What's that mean?
Symbolism,
Huh?
It's a
symbols.
symbol.
Satan.
Very easy to explain if you know where the number comes from. And it ain't what the conservative Christians think it is today. The number of the beast, 666.
Close to 7, though, isn't it?
Well, the number, and I'll tell you next week, the number defines one person specifically.
Wow.
Thank you,
Okay.
Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Nero.
Right.
Yeah.